warning Dostoevsky's philosophy will change your life forever. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the surface of your daily life? Beneath your habits, your choices, your relationships, beneath even your thoughts? Dostoevsky believed that human existence is not just a series of events, but a battle, a deeply personal and spiritual war happening within each of us. His philosophy forces us to confront the darkest corners of our minds and, if we're brave enough, to emerge with a clearer understanding of what it means to truly live. This isn't just theory, it's a lens through which you can see your life differently, and it might just change everything. Dostoevsky's central idea is that human beings are far more complex than we give ourselves credit for. We like to think we're rational, logical creatures, making decisions based on reason and common sense. But Dostoevsky tears this illusion apart. In works like Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, and Notes from Underground, he shows us that we're driven by irrational forces: fear, pride, guilt, love, despair, and hope. And here's the terrifying part: these forces often contradict each other. We contain multitudes, Dostoevsky says, and these multitudes are constantly at war. Let's take the underground man from Notes from Underground. This character is bitter, self-loathing, and filled with resentment. He understands that his actions are destructive, yet he continues to sabotage himself. Why? Because, as Dostoevsky brilliantly points out, human beings aren't just driven by logic or the pursuit of happiness. Sometimes we act against our own best interests simply to assert our freedom. Think about that for a moment. How often have you made a choice that you knew would hurt you, yet you did it anyway? Was it pride, a desire to prove something, or was it a deeper, almost unexplainable need to remind yourself that you're in control, even if that control leads to your own suffering? Dostoevsky's philosophy forces us to ask what really motivates us. Are we truly seeking happiness, or is there something deeper, a craving for meaning, for purpose, for a sense of connection to something beyond ourselves? And if so, how do we find it? This brings us to one of Dostoevsky's most profound ideas, the concept of suffering. In our modern world, we're taught to avoid suffering at all costs. We chase comfort, convenience, and pleasure, believing that these are the keys to a good life. But Dostoevsky disagrees. He believed that suffering is not just inevitable, it's essential. Why? Because suffering reveals who we really are. It strips away the masks we wear and forces us to confront our deepest truths. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits a murder, convinced that he's above morality, that he can rationalize his actions in the name of a greater good, but as the story unfolds, he's consumed by guilt, not because society judges him, but because he judges himself. His suffering becomes a crucible, burning away his arrogance and leading him to a profound spiritual awakening. Dostoevsky's message is clear: suffering isn't something to be avoided, it's something to be embraced, because it's through suffering that we grow.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
But here's the catch: suffering alone isn't enough. It's what you do with your suffering that matters. Dostoevsky challenges us to see suffering not as a punishment, but as a teacher. What is your pain trying to tell you? What truth is it forcing you to face? And this is the most important question: how will you respond? Will you let your suffering consume you, or will you use it to transform yourself? Now, think about your own life. How many times have you faced pain or hardship and tried to numb it, ignore it, or escape from it? What if, instead, you leaned into it? What if you saw it as an opportunity to understand yourself more deeply? Dostoevsky believed that the path to true freedom isn't found by avoiding life's struggles, but by confronting them head-on with courage and honesty. In the next part, we'll dive even deeper into Dostoevsky's philosophy of freedom, how he saw it not as the absence of constraints, but as the ability to choose meaning, even in the face of suffering. Because for Dostoevsky, freedom isn't just about what you do, it's about who you become. The ultimate freedom, choosing meaning over chaos. Dostoevsky's view of freedom is one of the most radical ideas in philosophy. When we think of freedom, we often imagine a life without constraints, no rules, no obligations, no limits. But Dostoevsky challenges this shallow concept of freedom. To him, real freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about taking responsibility for your choices, even when those choices bring pain or sacrifice. True freedom comes from living with purpose, from choosing meaning over chaos, even when the world feels absurd and unforgiving. Let's explore why this idea is so revolutionary. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky presents us with one of his most famous philosophical dilemmas, the story of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Christ returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition, but instead of being celebrated, he's arrested and condemned. The Grand Inquisitor explains why humanity, he says, doesn't want freedom. True freedom, with all its uncertainty and responsibility, is too much for most people to bear. Instead, people crave security, comfort, and someone to tell them what to do. They're willing to give up their freedom in exchange for bread, authority, and the illusion of control. Now pause for a moment and reflect. Do you see this in your own life? How often do we give up our freedom not to dictators or leaders, but to our own fears and desires? We let our insecurities dictate our choices. We let the need for approval, success, or comfort control us. We avoid hard truths because they're uncomfortable. We choose the easy path, not because it's right, but because it's safe. Dostoevsky's question is clear: are you truly free, or are you enslaved by the very things you think you want? Dostoevsky believed that real freedom requires us to confront these illusions. It requires us to embrace uncertainty, to live without guarantees, and to take full responsibility for our lives. But this kind of freedom is terrifying, isn't it? It means there's no one to blame for your choices but yourself. It means your life, your happiness, and your purpose are entirely in your hands. Here's where Dostoevsky takes us even deeper. He argues that freedom is meaningless unless it's grounded in something greater than ourselves. Without a higher purpose, freedom becomes chaos, a void where anything goes, but nothing matters. This is the existential crisis Dostoevsky explored in Crime and Punishment, Notes from Underground, and Demons. He saw what happens when people reject all higher values and try to create their own morality. The result isn't liberation, it's despair. Take Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. He believes he's free to act outside of traditional morality, to commit murder in the name of a greater good. But instead of finding freedom, he's consumed by guilt and isolation. Why? Because deep down he knows that true freedom isn't about breaking the rules, it's about living in alignment with a higher truth. Without that truth, freedom becomes a curse, not a gift. But Dostoevsky doesn't leave us in despair. He shows us a way out. For him, the key to real freedom is love, not romantic love, but a deep, selfless love that connects us to others and to the divine. Love, Dostoevsky says, is what gives life meaning. It's what grounds our freedom in something greater than ourselves. In The Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima teaches that each of us is responsible for everyone else. This isn't just a moral statement, it's a profound truth about freedom. When we love others, we're no longer trapped in the prison of our own egos. We're free to live for something beyond ourselves. So, what does this mean for us? It means that freedom isn't the absence of constraints, it's the ability to choose meaning, even in the face of suffering. It means taking responsibility for your life, not as a burden, but as an act of love. It means asking yourself, what higher purpose am I serving? What values am I living for? Now think about your own life. How often do you confuse freedom with comfort? How often do you avoid hard choices because they feel too risky, too uncertain? What might happen if you embraced the kind of freedom Dostoevsky talks about, the freedom to choose meaning over chaos, to live for something greater than yourself? In the next part, we'll explore how Dostoevsky's philosophy of suffering and freedom comes together in one of his most profound ideas, redemption. Because for Dostoevsky, life isn't just about enduring hardship or making choices, it's about transforming your suffering into something beautiful. The alchemy of suffering, turning pain into redemption. Dostoevsky's philosophy reaches its most profound depth in his exploration of redemption, the idea that suffering, when faced with courage and honesty, can transform us. To Dostoevsky, suffering is not an obstacle to happiness, but the very crucible in which we discover our truest selves. It's through suffering that we confront our weaknesses, confront our fears, and ultimately, confront the divine. Redemption is not just a spiritual concept for Dostoevsky, it's a way of living, a way of turning pain into meaning. Let's begin with a simple yet haunting question. How do you deal with suffering? Do you run from it? Do you numb it with distractions, with work, with entertainment? Or do you face it? Dostoevsky believed that most people spend their lives trying to avoid suffering, but in doing so, they miss the deeper truths it has to offer. Pain, he argued, strips away the superficial layers of our existence. It forces us to see what truly matters. And if we're willing to endure it, to sit with it, and to learn from it, it can lead us to a kind of spiritual awakening. Take Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. His journey is not just one of guilt and repentance, but of redemption through suffering. After committing murder, Raskolnikov is consumed by anguish, not just because he broke the law, but because he violated something sacred within himself. His suffering is unbearable, yet it's also his salvation. It's what forces him to confront the truth of his humanity, to recognize his need for love and forgiveness. By the end of the novel, Raskolnikov finds redemption not by escaping his suffering, but by embracing it. But what does redemption mean for us? Dostoevsky believed that redemption isn't about being perfect or erasing our mistakes. It's about transforming them. It's about finding meaning in our pain, even when it feels senseless. Think about the worst moment of your life, the moment that broke you, that shattered your sense of who you are. What if that moment wasn't the end of your story? What if it was the beginning of something new? This idea is at the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy. He believed that no one is beyond redemption, not the criminal, not the outcast, not the sinner. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dmitry Karamazov is a deeply flawed character, driven by greed and lust. Yet through his suffering, he begins to change. He starts to see the world differently, to recognize the beauty in even the smallest moments. His pain doesn't destroy him, it transforms him. Here's the paradox: Dostoevsky wants us to understand suffering can break us, but it can also heal us. It can push us to the edge of despair, but it can also bring us closer to grace. Why? Because suffering forces us to ask the most important questions. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I want to become? These questions are the foundation of redemption. But redemption isn't passive, it's active. It requires us to take responsibility for our lives, even when it feels impossible. It requires us to make choices, to act with courage, and to believe that change is possible. Dostoevsky teaches us that redemption isn't something that happens to us, it's something we create. It's the result of choosing to see our suffering not as a curse, but as an opportunity to grow. So, how do we apply this to our own lives? First, we must stop running from our pain. Instead of numbing it, we must face it. What is your suffering trying to teach you? What truth is it revealing about who you are and what you value? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Second, we must take responsibility for our actions. Redemption begins when we stop blaming others or the world for our pain and start asking, what can I do to make things right? And finally, we must choose love. For Dostoevsky, redemption is always tied to love for others, love for the divine, and love for life itself. Think about it. What if your greatest pain could become your greatest teacher? What if the parts of yourself you're most ashamed of could be transformed into something beautiful? Dostoevsky believed this was not only possible but inevitable if we approach life with honesty, humility, and courage. In the final part, we'll explore Dostoevsky's ultimate message, the interconnectedness of all human beings, and how love and responsibility for one another hold the key to a meaningful life. Because for Dostoevsky, redemption isn't just about the individual, it's about the collective. The sacred ties that bind us, love, responsibility, and the meaning of life. For Dostoevsky, the meaning of life cannot be found in isolation. He believed that our lives are inextricably tied to the lives of others, and it's in these connections that we discover our deepest purpose. At the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies a bold and transformative idea: we are all responsible for one another. This is not merely a moral obligation, it's a profound existential truth. To live fully, to live meaningfully, we must embrace this responsibility with love. Dostoevsky believed that love is the ultimate force that gives life meaning, but not the superficial, sentimental love we often hear about. He's talking about something deeper, a love that is selfless, courageous, and transcendent. This kind of love asks us to go beyond ourselves, to see the world through the eyes of another person, and to act not out of selfish desire, but out of compassion. It's the kind of love that requires sacrifice, humility, and a willingness to embrace the pain of others as our own. This idea is beautifully illustrated in the brothers Karamazov. Father Zosima, the spiritual heart of the novel, teaches that each of us is guilty before everyone, for everyone and everything on the surface. This might sound extreme. How can we be guilty for the actions of others? But Zosima isn't talking about guilt in a punitive sense, he's talking about the interconnectedness of all human beings. When we turn a blind eye to suffering, when we fail to act with kindness and love, we contribute to the brokenness of the world. Conversely, when we take responsibility for one another, even in small ways, we begin to heal that brokenness. Dostoevsky's message is clear: love is not just a feeling, it's an action. It's a choice we make every day. And it's through love that we transform not only ourselves, but the world around us. Love bridges the gap between individuals, reminding us that we are not isolated beings, but part of a greater whole. But here's the challenge: true love is hard. It requires vulnerability. It asks us to forgive when we've been hurt, to give when we feel empty, and to trust even when we've been betrayed. Dostoevsky understood this better than anyone. His own life was marked by immense suffering, poverty, exile, addiction, and loss. Yet through it all, he never lost faith in the power of love to redeem and transform. Now, think about your own life. How often do you act out of love? Not just for the people you care about, but for strangers, for those who frustrate you, for those you might even consider enemies. How often do you take responsibility for the well-being of others, even when you don't have to? What would your life and the world look like if you made love the center of everything you do? Dostoevsky challenges us to see love not as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete practice. He asks us to recognize that every action we take, no matter how small, has the power to bring us closer to one another or to push us further apart. He asks us to take responsibility for the world we create through our choices. At the end of The Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha Karamazov delivers a simple yet profound message: we are all responsible for everyone else, but I am more responsible than all the others. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate wisdom. The path to a meaningful life is not found in wealth, power, or even personal happiness. It's found in love, in responsibility, and in the sacred ties that bind us to one another. So, ask yourself, what kind of world are you creating? How are you showing up for the people around you? And what can you do today to live with greater love and responsibility? Dostoevsky believed that the answers to these questions hold the key to everything. And maybe, just maybe, he was right.